I wrote a goodbye letter because I believed cancer would finish what loneliness had already begun. But the truth is, the sharpest wound didn't come from the tumor. It came from realizing that my own family quietly stepped away and closed the door behind them. That is how my story begins. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 62 years old, and this is the moment my life split into a before and an after. The day Dr. Adams looked me in the eye and said, "Stage 2 breast cancer." The hospital air smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee. Across the waiting room, I saw clusters of patients sitting with husbands, wives, children, hands clasped, shoulders leaning into one another, whispered reassurances floating like a hymn. I found the last empty chair near the window, clutching my purse the way a child clutches a blanket. When Dr. Adams explained chemotherapy, side effects, and the importance of having someone beside me, I heard only one sentence reverberate in my chest: "You'll need support." I nodded politely, the way people nod when the truth is too heavy to carry in public. Afterward, I walked into the parking lot, dialed my son's number, and pressed the phone to my ear like a lifeline. "Mom, I'm in a meeting. Can you text?" David's voice was clipped. Efficient, the language of men who bill their lives in hours. My mouth went dry. "It can wait," I said softly, and the line went dead. The world blurred into steel and sunlight. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, whispering a promise. "I will fight the cancer. I will not beg for love." Chemo began the next week. I learned to pack a small kit: peppermints for the metallic taste, a cardigan for the cold rooms, and a notebook where I wrote questions for Dr. Adams, only to answer them later, alone at the kitchen table. Strangers, nurses, technicians became my familiar chorus. Emily, Dr. Adams's nurse, always tucked a blanket over my knees and asked, "Is someone coming to pick you up?" I smiled and lied. "Yes, they're just running late." Then I drove myself home with both hands gripping the wheel and the radio switched off so I could hear my breath, proof that I was still here. Hair fell out in startled handfuls one Saturday morning. I stared into the mirror at a practical woman who had never been vain, yet could not stop the tears sliding into the corners of her mouth. I dialed David again. "It'll grow back, Mom," he sighed, as if we were talking about a dent in his car. The call lasted 41 seconds. I counted. Grief often needs numbers to prove it happened. That evening, I tried Jessica, my daughter-in-law. Her voice was warm, honey poured over ice. "Eleanor, we've been praying for you. It's just been a situation. David's promotion, Ethan's soccer, my mother's health. We needed time to process." She said process as though my illness were a corporate memo routed for approval. 2 years passed like that, me in sterile rooms, surrounded by strangers who became my lifeline, while my family sent an occasional text or card. I learned a brutal arithmetic: 3 minutes of small talk for 3 hours of infusion. One generic card for 27 nights of silence, one thinking of you text for 1,000 unslept thoughts. If you've ever sat in a waiting room counting ceiling tiles because no one showed up for you, you know the ache I'm describing. If you've ever heard, "You're strong, you don't need help," from people who simply didn't want to show up, believe me, I see you. And then came the letter. Robert, my older brother, the stubborn, elegant bachelor who lived near the ocean and collected old maps, had died suddenly. His attorney wrote in careful legal phrases, "Robert bequeaths to his sister, Eleanor Hayes, all real property and investments held in his name." I read that line 3 times, and shame flushed through my relief. My brother, who had called less often than he should have, who still loved me in the quiet way men of his generation did, with savings and carefully drawn instructions, had given me more support in death than my son had in life. There is a moment when a woman packing her house becomes an archaeologist. I lifted a pan and found the scorch mark from the night my husband burned the stew because he was trying to make me laugh. I touched a coat and remembered the winter David still fit beneath my umbrella. I packed 27 years into boxes labeled kitchen, bedroom, books, and droplets of a former life. Movers sealed them shut, and we drove west to the coast. Robert's beach house waited at the end of a quiet lane, where the wind smelled of salt and citrus, and the sea scrawled its endless letters against the shore. Inside, the house was light and open. I could have told you the price of the floors, the provenance of the chandelier, the exact shade of the stone countertops, but whatever those details cost, peace was the only price that mattered. That night, for the first time in 2 years, I slept without waking at 3:11 a.m. to listen for fear. I remembered the last time I saw Robert. We'd argued about nothing, stubborn siblings sparring over wills and savings. He'd sighed and said, "Ellie, the world doesn't always wound you where you're weakest. Sometimes it strikes where you're kindest." Then, pouring me tea, he added almost as an afterthought, "I've taken precautions. If anyone tries to meddle in what's yours, they'll find a wall instead of a door." I thought he was just being dramatic. 6 weeks later, the doorbell rang. The silhouette behind the glass was unmistakable. Flawless hair, a dress that whispered when it moved, a gift bag cradled like an offering. "Eleanor," Jessica sang, stepping into the sunlight. "You look amazing. God works in mysterious ways. I brought Pinot, something celebratory." Her smile never reached her eyes. I stepped aside. "Come in." She glided through the living room, gaze darting across the windows, the rug, the art, the ocean view, like a scanner measuring value per square foot. Robert had exquisite taste, she breathed, and so close to town. David was curious about the estate, I mean. Taxes are so complicated. We want to help however we can. It's strange how a heart broken by neglect can still perform the smallest courtesies. I made coffee. I set out 2 cups. I asked after my grandson, Ethan. "He asks about you all the time," Jessica said smoothly, then added, "How are you managing such a big place? Chemo brain is real. I read an article. Some sentences sound like kindness, but are actually snares." I smiled into my cup. "I manage." She patted my hand with fingers unmarked by work. "We just want to be your support system. Family should come together." The word family stung like lemon on a paper cut. "Before we talk about anything else," she continued, "David wondered about power of attorney, purely for emergencies. After all you've been through, it would give everyone peace of mind." Robert's voice echoed in my head, a wall instead of a door. "I'm fine," I said, "and my affairs are in order." We danced through an hour of polite performance. She told me about Ethan's soccer, about David's work stress, about her mother's health. I told her the ocean had a way of teaching you how to breathe. We did not talk about the months I spent tethered to IV lines while they sent emojis. When she finally stood to leave, she hugged me, perfume cloying and perfect. "Dinner next weekend. David would love to see the place. He's been so worried." Worried floated between us. Pretty as a bubble and just as empty. At the door, she turned back. "Eleanor, are you forgetting less now?" "I keep excellent notes," I said. The house seemed to expand after she left, as if it had been holding its breath. I carried my coffee to the deck, watched the gulls carve circles in the air. until my neighbor Carol leaned over the fence. "Quite a visitor," she said. We sat with mugs warming our hands, her golden retriever pressing his head against my knee. "She asked if you'd seem forgetful," Carol said flatly. "Implied you might be unsafe. I told her you're sharper than me before my first coffee." Shame and fury thundered inside me. That night, my phone buzzed with a text from David. "So glad Jess saw you. Let's all come Saturday. We can help you plan for the future." I read it twice and heard what wasn't written. Dear listener, if you've ever been helped by people who meant to write your story with their own pen, tell me, what would you do? And if you're facing that now, what boundary would you draw? Before we go deeper into today's dramatic journey, remember to subscribe to Tangled Heart Stories and ring the bell for notifications. Here, you will always find stories of sacrifice, betrayal, and unexpected turnarounds. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below. Who knows, the next story might echo your own experience. The following morning, the ocean looked as though it was trying to whisper secrets only the patient could hear. I sat on the deck with my coffee cooling in my hand, Jessica's words replaying in my mind. "Are you forgetting less now?" A question disguised as concern, designed to plant doubt like a seed that could later grow into a claim. I knew better. I had survived cancer. I had survived nights when the silence of my phone was louder than any scream. I was not going to crumble under questions meant to make me doubt my own memory. Yet, anger has a way of sharpening awareness. Once you sense manipulation, you begin to see it everywhere. That afternoon, I visited Carol again. Her lemon loaf sat untouched on the table, but her words fed me more than any slice could. "Eleanor," she didn't just hint. She flat out asked me if you left burners on, if you looked confused walking the neighborhood. I told her no, but the way she smiled, like she already had the answer she wanted, it chilled me. That night, I pulled out Robert's letter again, rereading the part about the estate. I tried to imagine him sitting at his desk, stubborn, precise, anticipating that family might try to meddle. "A wall, not a door," he had promised. Perhaps he had foreseen more than I realized. Days later, while buying groceries, Mike, the store manager, paused before ringing up my items. His voice dropped low. "Eleanor, can I ask you something? Your daughter-in-law came by, asked if you ever seemed confused here, if you forgot your card or counted wrong at the register." His brow furrowed. I told her no, of course. You're one of the sharpest people I know. But why would she ask that? The weight in my chest grew heavier. She wasn't just testing me in my own home. She was building a case. I decided to visit Dr. Adams's office, not just for my routine checkup, but to speak with Emily. When I asked if anyone had contacted them about me, Emily hesitated. Then her professional mask slipped, and she admitted, "Jessica called several times, asking about cognitive decline after chemo. She wanted to know if you seemed mentally impaired." My stomach nodded. It was one thing to whisper to neighbors, another to question a doctor. This wasn't idle gossip. It was groundwork for something sinister. That evening, I returned home and sat at the wide oak table Robert had once polished himself. I spread out notes, Carol's testimony, Mike's words, Emily's confession, and I began to piece together a mosaic of betrayal. Every tile told the same story. Jessica was orchestrating a campaign to portray me as incompetent. The next blow came in the form of paper. Among the mail stacked by the door, I found a thin envelope slipped between insurance notices. Inside was a photocopy of a legal petition. David Hayes vs. Eleanor Hayes. My son's name against mine. My own child seeking guardianship over me. My hands trembled as I read the claims. Diminished mental capacity, inability to manage finances, susceptibility to confusion. And then, in the margins, Jessica's handwriting, notes circling large figures, underlining the word assets, scribbling reminders like document incidents. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It had ink, dates, signatures. It had become real. I sat at the edge of the bed, the paper quivering in my fingers. Grief wanted me to collapse, to cry, to curse, but something colder stirred within me. I counted aloud, 5 things I could see: the petition, the lamp, the curtain, my shoes, the sea. 4 things I could touch: the paper, the quilt, the cool glass of the window, my own pulse. 3 things I could hear: the ocean, a gull, the refrigerator humming. 2 things I could smell: coffee, salt, and 1 thing I could tell myself: you are not helpless. Later that night, the phone rang. David's voice filled the line, casual, almost cheerful. "Mom, Jess said the house is stunning. We'd love to come by Saturday, maybe go over some things. Make sure you're managing okay." My eyes fell on the petition lying open on the desk. My son's signature glared back at me. His voice sounded like a stranger's, and yet I steadied myself. "Saturday works," I said, tone calm, almost too calm. "I'll be ready." After hanging up, I knew I could no longer stay passive. This wasn't about disappointment in their neglect. This was survival. They had declared war not with fists, but with paper and whispers. And I would have to fight on their battlefield, calm, prepared, armed with proof. The next morning, I made my first call to Sarah Miller, the attorney who had handled Robert's estate. Her voice was confident, assured. After listening carefully, she said, "Eleanor, you're not the first woman to face this. Families sometimes see illness as opportunity, but Robert protected you. His trust documents are airtight. If David or Jessica pursue this, it will backfire. Still, we'll gather evidence, boundaries backed by law." Her words steadied me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like someone sharpening her claws. That evening, I met Carol again at the fence. She patted my hand, her golden retriever wagging beside her. "Whatever they're planning, you've got people here who see you. Don't forget that." In the days that followed, I moved with quiet purpose. I copied the petition, filed it neatly. I documented every call, every text, every suspicious conversation. I began recording interactions, not to feed paranoia, but to build defense. Each step felt like laying bricks for the wall Robert had promised me. Saturday approached. The air thickened with expectation. I prepared the house not with flowers or dinner, but with a binder of evidence and the steel of someone who had decided she would no longer beg for scraps of love. When the day finally came, I set the table anyway, because rituals matter, even in battle. Pasta, salad, bread, and beneath my chair, waiting, was the binder. They would not see the broken woman from the chemo chair. They would see a survivor armed with truth. And as I looked out at the ocean, restless and strong, I whispered to myself, "You've died once already, Eleanor. You will not die again. Not from betrayal." Saturday evening arrived draped in the kind of golden light painters try to capture, but never quite can. The ocean shimmered like polished glass, deceptive in its calmness. Inside Robert's house, the house that had become my sanctuary, I set the dining table with quiet precision: plates, forks, folded napkins. A bowl of salad glistened with lemon dressing, steam curled from the pasta dish, and bread warmed gently in the oven. It looked like a family dinner. In truth, it was a stage. When the doorbell rang, I took a slow breath and opened it. David stood there in a suit, tie loosened, looking like a man both exhausted and ambitious. Beside him, Jessica gleamed in a perfectly tailored dress, hair falling in practiced waves, her smile bright but brittle. "Mom," David said, stepping forward to kiss my cheek. The gesture felt rehearsed. "You look good." "I'm vertical," I replied with a small smile. "Come in." Their eyes swept the house the way buyers evaluate a property, appraising, not admiring. Jessica's gaze flicked over the chandelier, the wide windows, the art on the walls. David glanced at the security system by the door, the sturdy locks. We sat at the table, and for a while, we performed the ritual of small talk. Jessica spoke about Ethan's soccer games. David complained about deadlines at work. I asked polite questions, nodding as though these words meant something more than filler. Underneath, tension hummed like electricity in hidden wires. When plates were nearly cleared, Jessica placed her glass carefully on its coaster, folding her hands with practiced poise. "Eleanor," she began, voice soft with manufactured concern, "we've been thinking. Just as a precaution, it might be wise to set up some paperwork, something like power of attorney. Purely for emergencies, of course. It would give us all peace of mind." David nodded as though her suggestion were an afterthought rather than a plot rehearsed in whispers. "We just want to make sure you're safe, Mom. This house, your finances, it's a lot to manage alone." The air thickened. I reached beneath the table, lifted the binder onto my lap, and placed it on the table with deliberate care. Sliding out the petition copy, I spread it before them. My son's name, David Hayes vs. Eleanor Hayes, stared up from the page. David's face tightened, then smoothed into a mask. Jessica's smile flickered, but refused to die. "What is this?" I asked calmly. David shifted in his seat. "It's an old draft. Something we considered when you were sick. We were worried. We thought that I was incapable of handling my own life." I finished for him. Jessica leaned forward, her voice low and velvety. "It was never about control. It was about safety. You've been through so much. You might not realize how vulnerable you seemed." My pulse beat hard in my ears, but I kept my voice steady. "These margin notes," I said, tapping Jessica's handwriting circling large dollar figures, "don't look like safety. They look like shopping lists." Her smile thinned. "You're reading too much into it." At that moment, I reached for my phone and pressed play. From its small speaker, Jessica's voice, recorded on Carol's sidewalk, spilled into the room. "Has she seemed forgetful? Unsafe? Do you worry she might hurt herself or others?" The silence that followed was louder than any storm. David's jaw clenched. "Mom, you're making this adversarial. We panicked. We love you. If a judge had granted anything, it would have been temporary. A safety net." "A net," I echoed. "To catch me or to hold me?" Jessica's eyes burned. "You're paranoid. Recording neighbors? Who does that?" "Someone who knows her family is building a case against her," I said. "And someone who refuses to be trapped again." I let the silence linger, then pushed forward the second document Sarah had drafted, a formal declaration of my independence and the legal protections in Robert's trust. "Robert anticipated you. His estate has ironclad clauses. Any attempt to coerce me will trigger penalties. I am not your burden, your client, or your conquest. I am your mother and your mother-in-law, but I am not your victim." David stared at the paper, color draining from his face. Jessica's nails tapped against her glass in staccato rhythm. "You've changed," David said finally, his voice low, almost bewildered. "No," I answered, surprising myself with the steadiness of my tone. "I am the same woman who raised you, who worked nights so you could attend college, who stitched costumes for Ethan's school plays, I am the same. I've simply stopped begging for crumbs of love. Jessica stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. This conversation is over. Yes, I said, it is, but hear me clearly. You are welcome in my life only when you come without schemes. You will not call my doctors, question my neighbors, or touch my finances again. And you will not step into this house without my invitation. David opened his mouth, then closed it, caught between shame and loyalty. Finally, he rose, placing a stiff hand on my shoulder. Think about Ethan, he murmured. I am, I said softly. That's why I'm drawing these lines, because he deserves to know that family doesn't mean exploitation. It means love. They left in silence, Jessica's heels striking the floor like gavel blows. When the door closed, I leaned against it, my legs trembling. I had confronted them. For the first time, I hadn't folded into silence. Later that evening, Carol stopped by with her dog and a basket of apples. She listened quietly as I recounted the dinner. Her hand squeezed mine. You've built your wall, Eleanor. Now make sure it stands. That night, I sat by the window, the ocean lit by a swollen moon. For the first time in years, I felt not just alive but powerful. My son's betrayal had nearly broken me, but it had also forced me to rediscover my strength. I picked up my pen and began a new list. Secure legal counsel, document every interaction, protect Ethan from becoming their pawn, prepare for escalation, because I knew them. People driven by greed don't stop when the door is closed. They try to break the lock, and I was ready. The silence after that dinner lasted only a week. Silence in families like mine is never peace. It is strategy. I knew David and Jessica wouldn't retreat. Greed doesn't surrender. It recalculates. The first sign came on a gray Wednesday morning, a knock at the door. When I opened it, 2 uniformed officers stood politely on my porch. Mrs. Hayes? One asked. We received a welfare check request. The words chilled me. Welfare check, a phrase that sounds protective but can be weaponized. I invited them in, offering tea while they asked their rehearsed questions. Do you manage your medications? Do you ever forget the stove? Any issues with paying bills? I answered calmly, handing them my binder, medical notes, receipts, neatly typed schedules. The older officer scanned the documents, then smiled faintly. You're more organized than my wife, ma'am. Sorry to trouble you. The younger one added quietly, families sometimes misuse us in disputes. We see it a lot. When they left, fury simmered inside me. My son and his wife had called the police to paint me as unstable. They weren't just whispering anymore. They were escalating. I phoned Sarah Miller immediately. She listened, her voice sharpening. Eleanor, this is exactly why Robert placed protections in the trust. We'll file notice that any further attempts at coercion will be considered harassment. Start documenting every incident, dates, times, badge numbers. And remember, boundaries backed by law are stronger than words. That night, I sat on the deck, staring at the ocean. Betrayal has a taste. It's metallic, like blood bitten on the tongue. But anger has its own flavor, sharp and electric. I promised myself I would not simply survive their attacks. I would turn them into the architects of their own downfall. The storm broke 2 nights later. It was nearly midnight when the pounding began. My front door rattled under Jessica's fists. Eleanor, she screamed, open this door. You can't shut us out. When I didn't answer, she turned to violence. The crack of breaking glass sliced the silence as she smashed a side window. Shards rained across the floor like jagged confetti. She climbed through, eyes wild, hair disheveled, fury spilling out in waves. "You think you can humiliate us?" she spat. "You're destroying David's career, ruining our family. You're selfish, Eleanor. You don't know what's best for anyone, not even yourself." My phone was already in my hand. "This is Eleanor Hayes," I told the dispatcher, my voice steady. "There's a trespasser in my home." Jessica lunged toward the table where my binder sat. "This paper doesn't protect you," she shrieked, clawing at the petition copy I had laid there as bait. She tried to tear it in half, but the sirens arrived first. The police burst in, flashlights cutting through the dark. In seconds, Jessica was pinned, her arms wrenched behind her as she screamed, "You'll regret this. You'll die alone, Eleanor, and no one will even care." I stood calm, almost serene, as they led her out in handcuffs. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady. For the first time, I wasn't prey. I was witness to justice in motion. The following morning, the headlines made their way through town. Prominent executive's wife arrested for trespassing at mother-in-law's estate. The story spread quickly, faster than gossip could contain. David's firm put him on administrative leave, citing personal matters. Jessica's mugshot appeared on social media, her flawless facade cracked wide open. When David finally called, his voice shook with panic. "Mom, please, don't press charges. Jess was just stressed. Think of Ethan. He doesn't need to see his parents destroyed." "I am thinking of Ethan," I said evenly. "That's why I am pressing charges, because one day he needs to know his grandmother refused to be bullied into silence." There was a long silence on the line. Then he whispered, "You've changed." "No," I said softly. "I've remembered who I am." The legal wheels turned quickly after that. Jessica's arrest triggered scrutiny of the guardianship petition. Under oath, Carol, Mike, and Emily provided testimony. Neighbors and professionals confirming that Jessica had approached them with questions meant to discredit me. Every lie she had whispered became a weapon against her. Sarah filed motions that painted the picture clearly. I was competent, organized, protected by Robert's trust, and harassed by my own family. The court dismissed the guardianship petition with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. In its place, Jessica now faced charges for trespassing, harassment, and attempted coercion. I will never forget the look on her face in that courtroom, cold fury wrapped in tailored fabric, while the judge declared, "This court finds Mrs. Hayes fully competent and capable." The actions taken against her were not out of concern, but of manipulation. Such abuse of the guardianship system will not be tolerated. For once, it wasn't just my word against theirs. It was the law, standing on my side. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones pointed at me, questions flying. "How do you feel about your daughter-in-law's arrest? Do you think your son was complicit?" I lifted my chin. "Family is not defined by blood alone," I said. "It is defined by love, respect, and presence. I stand here today because I chose boundaries over betrayal, and I hope others watching will do the same." The words made the evening news. For a brief, surreal moment, my story became a symbol for other women who had been silenced by family greed. But the sweetest moment came not from headlines, not from court victories, but from a phone call a week later. A small, trembling voice whispered through the receiver, "Grandma, it's Ethan." My heart leapt. "Hello, sweetheart. They said I shouldn't call, but I miss you. I don't think you're crazy. I remember when you made me pancakes shaped like dinosaurs." Tears blurred my vision. "I remember too," I said softly. "And no matter what anyone tells you, you are always loved." "Can I see you?" he asked. "One day soon," I promised, "when it's safe." and when the time is right. After we hung up, I sat by the window, the ocean roaring like applause. My enemies had tried to break me with whispers and paperwork. Instead, they had exposed themselves. Revenge, I realized, doesn't always come with fire or fury. Sometimes it comes with calm evidence, steady voices, and the sight of handcuffs clicking shut. And sometimes, the sweetest revenge is simply surviving and thriving when others wished you small and silent. The weeks after the courtroom verdict passed like a strange new season. Half sunlight, half shadow. On one hand, I felt vindicated. For once, I wasn't the woman silenced in the chemo chair, or the mother begging for scraps of attention. I had stood up and spoken, and the world had listened. On the other hand, I mourned. Because even when justice is served, it does not erase the ache of knowing your own child was willing to sacrifice you for convenience and wealth. Neighbors treated me differently after the trial. Carol brought fresh bread and her golden retriever, who had learned that my lap was a safe place. Mike from the grocery store stopped by with bags of fruit and said, "You showed a lot of people what strength looks like." Emily from Dr. Adams's office sent me a card signed by half the nurses on the oncology floor. "You are our inspiration." I taped that card above my desk, not out of vanity, but to remind myself that what nearly destroyed me had, in some way, been transformed into light for others. David, meanwhile, retreated into silence. I heard through Carol's grapevine that he had been put on indefinite leave from his firm, his reputation tarnished by Jessica's arrest and the public humiliation of the guardianship case. Their house, once a shrine to their ambitions, went into foreclosure. And within months, whispers of their separation became public fact. Jessica fought her charges with all the fury of a cornered cat, but evidence stacked higher than her denial. The police report, the broken glass, my recordings, the testimony of neighbors. It painted her not as a concerned daughter-in-law, but as a calculating woman undone by her own arrogance. For some, this would have been enough, to see the greedy fall, to watch karma turn its wheel. But revenge is not a meal that leaves you full. It is only an appetizer. What truly feeds the soul is healing. So I turned inward. Toward the life I had left waiting. I began to garden again. Robert's backyard, once overgrown with weeds, bloomed with lavender and tomatoes. I joined Carol at her book club, laughing louder than I had in years. I volunteered twice a week at the local animal shelter, letting kittens curl in my lap as I read aloud to them. There was freedom in routine. There was peace in claiming space that had once felt like exile. One evening, as I watered the garden, my phone rang. Ethan's voice, soft but steady, filled my ear. "Grandma, can I tell you something?" he asked. "Always, sweetheart. Sometimes I pretend I'm at your house when I go to bed. I think about the pancakes and the stories, and then I'm not scared." Tears welled in my eyes, but my voice stayed even. "Then hold on to that, Ethan. Memories are doors nobody can lock, and one day, when it's safe, we'll make new ones." After the call, I sat on the porch until the stars filled the sky. I realized then that part of my healing would be not just in protecting myself, but in preserving hope for Ethan. Because children deserve at least one adult in their lives who doesn't barter love for power. On the second anniversary of my diagnosis, I walked into the children's hospital with a check for $50,000. "For families who have to walk this road alone," I told the director. I signed it in both my name and Robert's because he had been the wall behind me, even in death. The director's eyes filled with tears. "You'll change lives," she whispered. And in that moment, I felt something shift. I was no longer only Eleanor who had been betrayed. I was Eleanor who chose to heal. When people ask me what I learned, I say this: I learned that absence has a cost, and sooner or later the bill comes due. I learned that family is not defined by blood, but by presence, by kindness, by those who sit beside you in waiting rooms and don't look at the clock. I learned that boundaries are not selfish, they are survival, and I learned that sometimes the truest act of love is saying no. If you are listening to my story and you've ever been discarded, belittled, or treated as an inconvenience, know this: you are not alone. You deserve respect, not because of what you've given, but because of who you are. And if those closest to you refuse to see it, then it is not betrayal to draw the line. It is wisdom. Would you have done what I did? Would you have pressed charges against your own daughter-in-law, knowing it would tear the family apart? Or would you have stayed silent for the sake of appearances? Tell me in the comments, because your voice matters too. And please, if this story touched you, subscribe to Tangled Heart Stories. Here, we share tales of sacrifice, betrayal, and unexpected justice, because no one should carry these burdens alone. As I finish telling you this, the ocean outside my window continues to write its endless letters against the shore. Some days they read like grief, some days like grace, but always like truth. This is my truth. I did not die from cancer. I did not die from neglect. And I will not die from betrayal. I am Eleanor Hayes. I am alive. And I have built my wall,